Welcome, everyone, to the IHR History of Gardens and Landscape seminar. This is the second seminar of the, I should have put the second seminar of the summer term. I'm Michael Ann Mullen, and I'm one of the conveners. Before we start, let me remind you to please mute your computers now and turn off your video if you haven't done so already. As usual, we ask you to submit your any questions that you have for the discussion at the end. Please submit your questions via the chat box, and Stephen Smith will relay them to Anna Rose at the appropriate time. I think that's all of the practical matters I need to tell you. So it's to me now to introduce our speaker today, Anna Rose Schack, who is a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. And she's researching the language of vulnerability in early modern women's poetry. Her paper this evening, however, is reading Japanese gardens, because has risen from a side research interest that she has in Japanese gardens. In 2020, she co-organized the Durham Medieval and Early Modern Students Association course. Some of you may have heard the paper she gave then on the Heian period gardens, and she'll be mentioning the Heian period in her in her paper this evening. So Anna Rose, over to you, and thank you very much for coming this evening.
Hello everybody, and thank you so much, Michael Ann, and also to Lynn and Stephen for having me here this evening, and thank you to the Institute of Historical Research. So as Michael Ann said, I'm a PhD student researching early modern women's poetry. However, my side research interest is in Japanese gardens, and that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. So, my interest in Japanese gardens arose a number of years ago when I decided that I wanted a new creative hobby, something that I'd never done before, and that would have no other purpose than my own well-being and enjoyment. I settled on gardening. The first problem was, of course, that I didn't have a garden, living as I was at that time on the top floor of an inner city apartment. No matter, I had a terrace, so I decided that my gardening would happen in pots. I would start small and grow bigger. Now, at this stage, having absolutely no idea about anything to do with gardens, it says a lot about my approach to life in general that my next step was not to visit the garden centre, which in fact did not occur to me right away, but to visit the university library. I went to the library and chose a selection of books on English gardens, plants, and gardening. And about a week later, the extent of my folly was dawning on me. Not only was the world of gardening more enormous and complex than I'd ever imagined, but without an actual garden, abstract Latin plant names and gardening advice went in one ear and out the other. I was overwhelmed by the scope of my new hobby and its impracticality. So at this point, I started to assess my options. One would be forgiven for wondering why I didn't just pick something else, like knitting or drawing. But for some reason, I had my heart set on gardening and romanticized hopes for the peace, contentment, and escapism it would facilitate. Now, around the same time, in a Shakespeare reading group that I was co-running, I met a lady who had worked as a nurse for the Dutch Merchant Navy during the 1950s. After marrying her husband, one of the sailors, his work took him to Japan, and she spent a number of years traveling with him. She told me that while there, she became fascinated by the gardens, and in subsequent years began to share her research, observations, and interest in lectures and talks in the Netherlands. She lent me many of her books on the subject, and I was hooked. I had my new hobby, Japanese gardens. However, the more I delved into my reading on Japanese gardens over the years, the more I began to realize the depth of the relationship between Japanese gardens and literature, stretching back to the 8th century. For more than 1,000 years, these gardens have sprung into life through the written word, allowing us to move through Japanese gardens as imaginative spaces. Japanese gardens have not only offered colorful settings or luscious imagery, but historically have formed an integral part of Japanese literary expression. Whether in poetic landscapes or in ancient records that preserve the details of actual gardens long since lost to the ravages of time, we are able to explore Japanese gardens through the written word. More recently, some contemporary writers have also drawn attention to the parallels between constructing a Japanese garden and the writing process itself. Tan Tuan-eng, the author of the novel The Garden of Evening Mists, which won the Man Asian Literary Prize in 2013, and the Man Booker Prize in 2012, or was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2012, and which was released as a feature film in 2019, makes the following observation. Japanese gardening demands a supreme degree of artifice, and so does writing fiction. Writing my novel, it occurred to me that the process was similar to constructing a Japanese garden. Both art forms employ artfulness and lies. Like every tree and plant and view and rock arrayed in the garden, every sentence, every word, every punctuation mark in my book had to be carefully considered and positioned. For a novel and a garden to succeed, the lie has not only to convince, it must also seduce. It has to beguile. Moreover, looking back the other way to observe the material Japanese garden, our own reading strategies can help us encounter these gardens. Japanese gardens themselves deploy various narrative techniques such as symbolism, allusion, metaphor, and framing to invite being read and interpreted as textual spaces. As Sophie Walker puts it, the Japanese garden resists being reduced to any single reading. It challenges the visitor to engage in states of transition in which scale, content, and meaning shift, giving the garden a profoundly mysterious poetic quality. The idea that Japanese gardens invite being read can help us understand why they not only translate so well into literature, but how they can also operate on a structural level within literary texts. In Walker's 2018 book, The Japanese Garden, she explains that the path is the most powerful design device used by the garden maker to set out both a physical journey and a poetic way of seeing. We are expected to follow the path without straying, for it strictly determines what is revealed, and how, and when. Our journey is punctuated by elements such as gateways, bridges, lanterns, fences, and wash basins, all of which serve to define specific moments of the garden experience. The Japanese garden is not passive, but active and directive, even chronological, like the words of a poem set down in order, a carefully crafted means to gain a particular understanding. In literature, writers translate the visuality of the garden into the verbal. It's called ekphrasis. From the Greek, ekphrasis is the means by which one work of art seeks to bring to life and illuminate another work of art. Taking the highly cultivated spaces of Japanese gardens as a visual work of art, centuries of writers have participated in an ekphratic tradition that represents these highly cultivated artistic spaces in literary texts. In this evening's talk, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the interrelation between nature, gardens, and classical Japanese literature, before moving on to consider how 4 contemporary novelists construct the Japanese garden in global fiction. Looking at The Phone Box at the Edge of the World by the Italian novelist Laura Imai Messina, The Garden of Evening Mists by Malaysian novelist Tan Tuan Eng, The Samurai's Garden by the American novelist Gail Tsukiyama, and An Artist of the Floating World by English novelist Kazu Ishiguro. I will consider how Japanese gardens materialize in fiction as poetic and imaginative landscapes. Although it will be a whistle-stop tour, I hope to provide an insight into the way in which Japanese gardens function as spaces of encounter that drive the psychological development of characters and themes across the novels. I examine the gardens as emotionally charged spaces of memory, nostalgia, longing, hope, and desire that build on the foundations of classical Japanese literature. I hope by the end of my talk that I'll have demonstrated not only the rich literary history intimately connected to and emerging from Japanese gardens, but will have also offered an introduction to certain texts and reading strategies that will allow you to enter the world of Japanese gardens from the comfort of your own homes. We have records of classical Japanese poetry dating from the middle of the Nara period, 710 to 784 AD. And the Manyoshu, known as the Collection of 10,000 Leaves, is the earliest poetry anthology. It dates from circa 759 AD and contains more than 4,000 poems. As the scholar Mark P. Keane notes, classical Japanese poetry, also called waka, can be considered a form of nature poetry, in that poems are almost always set the scene by incorporating a season and some element of the natural world, a plant, a bird, a landscape, and so on. End quote. These poems also interweave these natural elements with the emotional landscape of the speaker. We experience how the speaker's emotions emerge from and respond to the natural world. Nature is both a source of experience and a visual manifestation of interior life. A few examples of poems from the Manyoshu are as follows. Ah, sweet iris, your face flushed pink. Unexpectedly, I remember you and sigh. Or, written during the rainy season on the day when the weather cleared. The flood waters form endless showers, ruin the white flowers, bring bits of flotsam and jetsam. Why not a girl for me? As we can see in these two examples, the natural world and the speaker's emotional states are intertwined. The iris in the first poem and the ruined white flowers in the second simultaneously provoke and reflect the speaker's wistful longing. From this era forward, unfulfilled desire, lament, and nostalgia develop in Japanese poetry as dominant emotional modes that arise from and respond to the natural world. However, other poems in the Manyoshu deal more specifically with the natural world within the borders of a garden, emphasizing that there is indeed a distinction between the two. As if to win the hearts of the warblers, singing so sweetly in the meadow flushed with spring, the plum blossoms opened, smiling on my garden. This is an infinitely more optimistic poem that positions the smiling plum blossoms as flirtatious coquettes, amorously looking beyond the boundaries of the garden to win the hearts of the birds in the meadow. It's one of the earliest descriptions we have of this clear distinction between nature and artifice in Japanese gardens, which nevertheless sought to represent the natural world. Noting that the poem is from one lover to another, the poem sets up the relationship between the meadow and the garden, with a warbler in the former and a plum blossom in the latter. Both warblers and plum blossoms are associated with spring, and as the birdsong drifts into the garden, the anthropomorphized plum blossom smiles in return as if to draw these birds towards her. There is a reciprocity between the sweet meadow warblers and smiling plum blossoms that draws the natural world into the garden, even as the garden looks beyond its own borders for stimulation and inspiration. In the centuries following the Manyoshu, there were a myriad of other poetic anthologies that allow us to trace the continuing significance of the garden as a space of encounter, longing, and desire. In the Gozen Rakoshu from 951 AD, we read, "My beautiful garden hedge filled with deutzia blossoms, brilliant as white cloth, yet no one stops to see this sight, my only visitor, sadness." In this poem, the melancholy of the speaker is accentuated by the beauty of the garden, as much as the beauty of the garden is accentuated by the speaker's lament. Speaker and garden exist symbiotically, emerging through each other. The garden hedge, resplendent in blossoms, also operates as a metaphor for the barrier between the speaker and other people. With an absence of visitors, he is quite literally hedged off. And another speaker in a poem in the Koken Wakushu is a little boulder, trespassing beyond someone else's garden border and stealing their flowers. "I took a chrysanthemum from a garden where it had begun to bloom. Why on earth did I do that? Even its color has started to fade." Plucking this flower from someone else's garden sets up the idea of flowers as personal property and gardens as private spaces, drawing attention once more to the clearly defined boundaries of gardens and a boundary that the speaker has transgressed. However, the stolen chrysanthemum and the destruction of its beauty is a juicy metaphor that lends itself to a multiplicity of interpretations. Mark P. Keane, in his discussion of chrysanthemums, notes that they were associated with long life in China, a custom which transferred to Japan. Taking the chrysanthemum as a symbol of longevity, the speaker's actions have cut its life short, a situation he deeply regrets. Keane also notes that the chrysanthemums were used as an avatar for the obliquely proffered daughter in the Tale of Genji, a Heian period novel. What did the speaker pluck? A literal flower, or perhaps a virginal woman whose allure has faded on closer acquaintance? As we can see in these poems, gardens and their offerings provided richly metaphorical material for early Japanese writers to develop emotional landscapes in their poetry. These examples we have just considered are drawn from various poetry anthologies dating from the Nara and Heian periods. In the Heian period, which lasted between 794 and 1185 AD, poetry and gardens were integral to the lives of courtiers, and the ability to recite verse was an ideal to which they aspired. As Mark P. Keane explains in his book, Songs in the Garden, in the Heian period, the imagery of poems known only too well by the imperial courtiers, and the imagery of the gardens they built at their residences were so completely intertwined and interrelated that when a garden was observed, it was understood in a poetic manner, not simply as an object to be appreciated visually, a lovely thing like a picture or a sculpture, well designed and well balanced with its various colors and textures properly arranged, but something that was filled with symbolic imagery, visual metaphors derived from a well-known body of poetry. As Keane explains, poetry gave gardens a language and a voice, as much as the gardens themselves inspired the outpouring and content of poetry. The evidence of this poetic mode of expression among the Heian aristocracy comes from an abundance of literary sources that survive from the Heian courts, including the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon and the Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikabu, written in the early 11th century. Murasaki Shikabu was a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court. The Tale of Genji is famous for being cited as the world's first novel, as in, there is a prose narrative which facilitates the psychological development of characters. Her novel details the romantic infatuations and erotic trysts of the incorrigible Prince Genji. It's an exceptionally long novel, and one that is notoriously difficult to translate due to the 11th century Japanese language, the richness of allusions, which would be completely lost on modern readers, and the complexity of character names. As Ian Baruma wrote in a discussion of the Tale of Genji translations in The New Yorker, a literal translation of Genji would be unreadable. Nevertheless, it's through this novel, transmitted to us through the palimpsestic overlay of numerous English translations, that we are able to experience a literary representation of Heian gardens and their centrality to aristocratic life and romantic love. The Japanese scholar Ivo Smits, in a recent book chapter entitled Negotiating Nature at the Heian Court, explains that gardens in this tale offer profound insight into both how Heian courtiers related to nature and the structure of its protagonists' relationships. In this sense, nature and basic structures in the tale are intimately connected. Smits draws attention to the idea that nature imagery and the emotional lives of the protagonists are intertwined, with nature both triggering and resonating with emotional expression, just like in the poetry anthologies we've sampled. This novel is littered with references to gardens, flowers, natural beauty, and persistent tension between interior and exterior spaces. Amorous lovers are often found lurking outside the windows, walls, and fences of their beloved's quarters. I will now read a short passage from chapter 4. It was morning when the mist lay heavy over the garden. After being many times roused, Genji at last came out of Rakujo's room, looking very cross and sleepy. One of the maids lifted part of the folding shutter, seeming to invite her mistress to watch the prince's departure. Rakujo pulled aside the bed curtains and, tossing her hair back over her shoulder, looked out into the garden. So many lovely flowers were growing in the borders that Genji halted for a while to enjoy them. How beautiful he looked standing there, she thought. As he was nearing the portico, the maid who had opened the shutters came and walked by his side. She wore a light green skirt exquisitely matched to the season and place. It was so hung as to show to great advantage the grace and suppleness of her stride. Genji looked round at her. "Let us sit down for a minute on the railing here in the corner," he said. "She seems very shy," he thought, "but how charmingly her hair falls about her shoulders." And he recited the poem, "Though I would not be thought to wander heedlessly from flower to flower, yet this morning's pale convolvulus I fain would pluck." As he said the lines, he took her hand, and she answered with practiced ease. "You hasten, I observe, to admire the morning flowers while the mist still lies about them," thus parrying the compliment by a verse which might be understood in a personal or a general sense. At this moment, a very elegant page, wearing the most bewitching baggy trousers, came among the flowers, brushing the dew as he walked, and began to pick a bunch of the convolvuli. Genji longed to paint the scene. The novel is peppered with details like these that allow us to see the multifarious ways in which the gardens were used. On a practical, physical level, they were spaces that offered decorations for the court, spaces in which to be entertained, spaces in which to meet romantic partners, spaces in which to conceal oneself to listen to a lady playing music in her quarters. Ultimately, the gardens are spaces of encounter or potential encounter. And, in keeping with the courtly ideals of the time, poetic verse was the dominant discursive mode of these encounters. The lovers adopt a highly metaphorical garden discourse to enact their veiled flirtation. Speaking the language of gardens, these lovers can draw on the rich body of poetry, such as that found in the anthologies, or they may be moved to spontaneously devise their own verses in that tradition. While scholars such as Keen have noted that it's unrealistic to suppose that all Heian courtiers wandered around spouting poetry in their gardens, The literature of the period certainly establishes this practice as a pervasive ideal. From the Heian period onwards, Japanese gardens continued to be the subject of gardening manuals, treatises, and of course, poetry. However, it wasn't until the end of Japan's isolationist policy in 1853 that Western scholars, writers, and gardeners were able to more fully encounter the richness of Japanese gardens. Turning our attention towards the Japanese garden in contemporary fiction, I suggest that novelists harness the rich literary tradition connected to Japanese gardens in order to develop their characters. I suggest that the gardens depicted in these novels participate in Japan's literary garden heritage by developing themes such as grief, longing, nostalgia, memory, and encounter. The literary gardens are carefully planted in the reader's mind to illustrate the nuances of characters' interior emotional landscapes. In such a way, the gardens are not merely settings or backdrops. They are in fact working to facilitate the psychological development of characters on a more structural level. Being able to visualize these gardens through the written word ultimately allows the reader to better visualize characters within the novel. The first novel I want to look at to consider these claims is The Phone Box at the Edge of the World. The Italian writer Laura Imai Messina, who has been living in Tokyo for the last 15 years, published this novel in 2020. The novel is inspired by the true story of a phone box that was erected in a garden near the city of Atsuchi after the 2011 tsunami. As the foreword to Messina's novel notes, inside there is an old black telephone, disconnected, that carries voices into the wind. Thousands of people make the pilgrimage there every year. Though based on a real garden, the novel tells the fictional story of a young woman, Yui, who lost her 3-year-old daughter and her mother in the tsunami. The novel details her subsequent pilgrimage to this phone box in the Belgravia garden and her growing relationship with Takeshi, a man who lost his wife in the same disaster. Noting that the garden murmured incessantly, as if the voices from nearby villages were merging and flowing into this swathe of land, Yui asks, how could the feeling of lightness be explained otherwise? Death in this place felt like a beautiful thing. As she walked around the garden, Yui imagined those people's spirits being called out in a register. The garden, as a site of pilgrimage, a place of memory and reflection, links its visitors to the spirits of those departed. Calling a loved one from the phone box is a spiritual exercise, driven by collective imagination and sustained by the active participation of the visitor. With her ear pressed to the receiver, she would become absorbed in a view of the garden on that remote hillside in northeast Japan. As she shares, from there she could see the glittering sea, smell the salt rising up in ripples. From there, Yui would dream of talking to her daughter, whose life had ended only after 3 years, and her mother, who had held the little girl in her arms until the very end. End quote. As such, when a typhoon threatens Belgravia and its phone box, Yui hastens to protect the garden, even at risk to her own life. As is shared in the opening chapter of the novel, now the typhoon was almost upon her, and Yui finally noticed it. Strong winds were common in that area, especially in summer. They tore up the landscape, overturned roofs, and scattered tiles across the earth like seeds. Yui's fierce desire to protect Belgravia is indicative of her desire to protect the garden that nurtured her grief and allowed her to both encounter her dead and forge new relationships with people who understood the devastation of her loss. The simile that compares the scattered debris from a natural disaster to seeds that will replenish the landscape speaks to the novel's optimism that from great loss, emerges possibilities for new growth and new relationships. John Dickson Hunt's essay, Ekphrasis Deja Vu All Over Again, in his 2016 volume of essays, Sight, Sight, Insight, Essays on Landscape Architecture, offers an interesting perspective on the literary experience of actual gardens. He suggests that, and I quote, "It has been argued that all criticism of visual art is essentially ekphrasis. But what can be repeated in words about a garden or landscape is not the same as the garden or landscape itself, though it may direct us to what we should see and learn from that experience." In terms of encountering the Garden of Belgravia and the phone box of the wind, Hunt's observation is key. Messina's literary depiction is a fundamentally imaginative exercise that may not exactly correlate to our own experience of visiting the garden, but it nevertheless offers us a greater depth of understanding how we may emotionally situate ourselves in its landscape. Messina's story builds a garden of the mind more than any particular visual representation of the garden itself. A more detailed representation of the formal elements of a traditional Japanese garden is found in the entirely fictional gardens in Gail Tsukiyama's best-selling novel, The Samurai's Garden, published in 1994. Set during the Second World War, this novel tells the story of a Chinese student, Stephen, recuperating from tuberculosis in his family's summer home in Japan, against the backdrop of the Japanese occupation in China. However, in this beachside fishing village, the war seems very far away. Here, Stephen spends time with the reserved and stoical housekeeper and master gardener, Matsu. Matsu also introduces Stephen to Sachi, the woman Matsu had loved his whole life. It is a love that speaks through his quiet acts of service, supporting her as she lives out her life in a leper colony in a mountainside village. The gardens in the Samurai's Garden are geographically removed from the wider world, heightening the sense that they are spaces of refuge. The first garden is at Stephen's father's beach house, far away from the battles raging in China. The second garden is even more remote, a sanctuary in a mountainside leper colony. In this colony, Sachi's garden is one of her greatest sources of solace. As she shares with Stephen, "You have seen what kind of garden Matsu made for me. He returned that afternoon carting 2 bags of grey, palm-sized flat stones. The next weeks were spent clearing the land and planning what would be placed where. I have never seen Matsu so excited as the day we began to lay the stones down carefully side by side until we had formed rippling patterns. It will be a garden created from your imagination," he said, urging me to rearrange the stones any way I wanted them to be. Stephen-san, I spent hours rearranging those stones as if they held some strange, mesmerizing power that brought me calm. Day after day, Matsu carried bags and bags of pebbles and stones of different shapes and sizes with the help of a borrowed mule and cart. I anxiously awaited them as if I were trying to fit each piece together in a complicated puzzle I needed to finish. I felt as if I had fallen into a trance, which I couldn't come out of until the garden was completed. With Matsu's help and patience, I had created something from the most common elements. And when the garden was finally finished, I realized for the first time in my life that I had accomplished something. What I thought would be barren and distant was instead filled with quiet beauty. I remember I turned to Matsu as we stood looking at the rock garden and asked, "Did you know it would be so simple and so beautiful?" The garden she is describing is of course a karasansui, or a dry rock garden with pebbles and rocks arranged to form a dynamic and richly textured landscape. Her garden is a work of art and a labor of love, which she tends to and maintains daily by raking the stones. Sachi's garden is a place of continual creation and healing, a project that she shares with Matsu and one that binds them closer together. It is a highly romanticized evocation of a Japanese garden, and yet I would argue that this Japanese garden does not merely lend itself as a backdrop to their romance, but in fact mirrors the emergence of intimacy on a more structural level. Though these gardens are reflective of the natural world, they are restrained spaces. They strive to give the appearance of nature and yet are highly cultivated. Thus, while the overarching effect is one of serenity and tranquility, there is an underlying tension between nature and artifice. Particularly in dry rock gardens, observers often notice the tension that emerges from the position of the rocks holding each other in balance, the gardener having carefully positioned the rocks in relation to each other to evoke a particular mood. Similarly, Matsu and Sachi are held in balance, carefully cultivating and tending to a relationship that, due to the stigma of leprosy, must exist outside of traditional marital relations. Their love and commitment to each other is undeniable, and yet their relationship is underpinned by the tensions of shame, honor, regret, and grief. Nevertheless, the tranquility and serenity that they cultivate is akin to their work in the rock garden. Namely, it is intentional and reflective. Their stoic steadfastness, as much as their relational tenderness, holds their shared future in balance. In Tan Tuang-Eng's 2012 novel, The Garden of Evening Mists, the Japanese garden is also used as a space in which to explore intimacy and the psychological trauma of grief. Predominantly set in a Japanese garden in the central highlands of Malaya, in various temporalities between World War II, the 1950s, and the 1980s, The Garden of Evening Mists tells the story of Yun Ling, a woman who, as a young woman, had been interned by the Japanese during their occupation, and her later relationship with Aritomo, former gardener to the Emperor of Japan. While interned in a prisoner of war camp, Yunling and her sister, who had a passion for Japanese gardens, turned to these gardens as imaginative spaces in which they could escape from the horrors, torture, and humiliations around them. Reflecting back on that time, Yunling shares that the garden became our refuge. Inside our minds, we were free. Nevertheless, it is revealed at the beginning of the novel that her sister died in the camp, and Yunling now wants to realize her sister's dream, constructing the Japanese garden as a memorial. Although Aritomo refuses her commission, he takes her on as his apprentice to teach her how to build her own. He tells her, "You cannot learn gardening from books." And it's true. If you want to know about Japanese moss varieties, or when to plant chrysanthemums, or how to train a tree, I am not your girl. But what Yunling reminds us as readers is that these gardens can exist beyond material reality, as refuges in the mind transmitted through the written word. The name of Aritomo's garden, Yugiri, translated as evening mists, heightens this sense of stepping into another world for both the characters and the reader. As Angelia Poon notes, traversing the boundaries of the material and metaphysical worlds, Yugiri appears paradoxically an evanescent and timeless sanctuary. End quote. The author himself tries to evoke the garden as a retreat from the world. As he notes in his essay, Even the Moon Borrows Its Light from the Sun, from the first sentence, I knew that a tale about this kind of garden could not have a hurried, undisciplined pace. To step into a Japanese garden is to enter another world, where the passage of time is slowed down, where the stillness between each beat of the human heart is stretched out as long as possible. My text had to reflect that sensation for the reader. the choice of words, the arrangement of scenes, the chapter lengths, the rhythm of each paragraph, each sentence. By retreating inside the novel, we are afforded a double retreat inside the stillness and meditativeness of the garden. It's partly why researching Japanese gardens is such a relaxing research area. One cannot hurry the observation of stones or the interpretation of plants. Tan Tuang Eng also draws attention to the connection between shaki, or the art of using borrowed scenery, and imagined worlds. He suggests that as readers, we borrow from our lives, memories, and experiences to flesh out the images that the author offers us, in the same way that Japanese gardens borrow elements from beyond their own borders. This concept of borrowed scenery, or shaki, became popular in 17th century garden design. This technique involves incorporating an element from beyond the garden into the visual frame of the garden, effectively enlarging the garden space and complementing its compositional balance. In the novel, Yunling shares that, "Through the windows, I watch the mists thicken, wiping away the mountains borrowed by the garden. Are the mists, too, an element of shaki incorporated by Aritomo? I wonder, to use not only the mountains, but the wind, the clouds, the ever-changing light. Did he borrow from heaven itself?" The construction of a garden in dialogue with its setting mirrors the construction of a novel that only emerges fully realized through dialogue with its readers. To use the mountains, the wind, the changing light, and seasons is to create a garden that is never fixed or stable, but in constant creation. As the practice of reading relies on the reader bringing their own emotions, memories, and experiences to interpret the words on the page, no novel, no garden will ever be experienced in the same two ways. Even as they seduce us with their aesthetic beauty, gardens and novels invite our interpretation, relying on us as active participants to bring them to life. Before we finish, I want to turn our attention briefly to a Japanese garden that exemplifies the interplay between a garden narrative and its reader. Kazu Ishiguro's An Artist of the Floating World, published in 1986, won the Whitbread Book of the Year and was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Set between 1948 and 1950, the novel is narrated from the perspective of the now retired artist Masuji Ono. As he grapples with the legacy of his nationalistic painting in the post-war landscape, it becomes evident that Ono's narration of events and memories is unreliable. This narrative instability primarily centers around his perception of his reputation and his own sense of self-importance. Alongside negotiating his daughter's marriage and drinking with old friends, tending to his garden is one of his main retirement activities. I'm going to read a short passage from the novel. From the perspective of Ono. I recall one afternoon, for instance, Noriko arriving home as I was pruning some shrubs out in the garden. She had greeted me from the veranda in a perfectly civil way before disappearing again into the house. Then, a few minutes later, I was sitting on the veranda, looking out at the garden to assess the effect of my work, when Noriko, now changed into a kimono, appeared again with some tea. She put the tray down between us and seated herself. It was, as I recall, one of those last splendid autumn afternoons we had last year, and a tender light was falling across the foliage. Following my gaze, she said, "Father, why did you have to cut the bamboo like that? It looks unbalanced now." "Unbalanced? Do you think so? I think it looks balanced enough. You see, you have to take into account whether younger shoots are dominant." "Father tends to meddle too much. I think he's going to ruin that bush too." "Ruin that bush too?" I turned towards my daughter. "Whatever do you mean? You're saying I've ruined another?" "The azaleas have never regained their looks. That's what comes of father having so much time on his hands. He ends up meddling where it's not required. Excuse me, Noriko, I don't quite see your point. You're saying the azaleas are unbalanced too? Noriko looked at the garden again and gave a sigh. You should have left things as they were. I'm sorry, Noriko, but to my eyes, both the bamboo and the azaleas are much improved. I'm afraid I don't see your unbalanced aspect at all. Ono and his daughter clearly do not see the garden in the same way. The unbalanced shrubbery over which they quibble is a visual manifestation of the competing perspectives that undermine Ono's first-person narration. One is left unsure as to whether Ono's memories, reflections, and accounts accurately reflect the situation he describes, or whether they have been over-pruned and shaped to fit his desire for recognition as an artist of renown. Unlike the three other novels discussed this evening, the garden in An Artist of the Floating World is, in this instance, a space of contention and disagreement that reflects the discord between the characters. Though the garden in the phone box at the edge of the world was destroyed by a typhoon, the mountainside village in the samurai's garden damaged by fire, and the garden in the Garden of Evening Mists left to decay, the garden in An Artist of the Floating World remains a tranquil, though apparently lopsided, idyll. Rather than cultivating a focus on aesthetic beauty or a state of equilibrium threatened by outside forces, Ono's garden is fundamentally a space of disequilibrium that mirrors the imbalance between Noriko and her father. As such, the garden in this novel operates as a setting which nuances the subjectivity of perception, and indeed the subjectivity of artistry, whether garden making or novel writing itself. All four novels invite the reader to step into the Japanese garden. The first three novels I discussed set up the garden as a site of pilgrimage, in which loss and grief are processed and reimagined as new possibilities for varying forms of love. In The Garden in the Phone Box at the Edge of the World, Yui finds a new family, a new community, and a new way of communicating with her deceased daughter. In The Samurai's Garden, Matsu and Sachi build a garden as an expression of love and intimacy, an act of creation that substitutes for the child they will never bear. In The Garden of Evening Mists, Yunling also finds romantic love and the ability to memorialize the death of her sister. Though infused with the pain, grief, and suffering, these gardens are ultimately generative places that offer characters a space in which to process their losses. However, the final novel, An Artist of the Floating World, breaks away from this paradigm of the Japanese garden in global literature, instead foregrounding the significance of perspective and the acts of storytelling, reading, and garden making as fundamentally subjective experiences. As Sophie Walker writes, "We must be clear. The Japanese garden is neither sacred nor untouchable. It can be understood and given context beyond its native setting. It can be investigated by the foreign, by the scholar, and the casual visitor. It is not an object of history or a museum. It is alive, and it demands our engagement and imagination for centuries to come." Taking Walker's sentiment, I hope that today's talk has been able to give you a starting point from which to explore Japanese gardens through the written word. And as we step into these literary gardens, we can learn new strategies and techniques for reading material Japanese gardens as textual spaces. If you're interested in embarking on your own journey into the world of Japanese gardens, I've made a list of some resources which I can also paste into the chat. The list of books, most of which I've mentioned this evening, are all readily available. I'm hoping to continue to develop my research in this area and perhaps develop it into an article for publication. I'm very happy to take any questions, and I thank you all so much for your time this evening.
Thank you very, very much, Anna Rose. What a very rich kind of discussion of the garden. and very interesting to talk about the early poetry and literature before going on to the contemporary garden. Stephen, I think, is up there ready to take questions if we have any. Do we have any, Stephen, in the...
Michael Ann, I see there's one from you to start us all off.
Right.
Marvelous. So, the first question is from Michael Ann. I'll read it out. Do you find similarities between literary gardens of the Heian period and gardens represented in European medieval manuscripts like the Roman de la Rose?
As an early modernist, I'm not particularly familiar with the tradition of European medieval manuscripts that exists somewhat on the periphery of my research period, being more in the 16th and 17th century. However, I think that would be a fascinating avenue for exploration, and perhaps may add depth and global context to my research if I could perhaps place it in dialogue with what was happening in medieval Europe.
Michael Ann, was there, as you're online, is there anything that you particularly wanted to ask there? Where do you see the crossovers?
Well, I mean, I wrote the question actually after I had kind of read the resume of what you were going to speak about, Anna Rose. So it wasn't generated by the talk as such. And then I was during the talk and I thought, oh, is this a relevant thing? But I think it is. I think that the medieval period, when you have those beautiful illuminated manuscripts, but you have a story which uses the garden very symbolically about the relationship. I think there are some crossovers.
Yeah, I would really love to look into that. I think actually, I know there's a PhD student at Durham, Charlotte Spencer, who's working on medieval French and Italian literature, and she may be one to watch out for in the future. She's doing some very exciting work on gardens in manuscript culture.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Just leading on from that, one of my own thoughts actually has been about Dante and the use of the idea of the wood. He starts off the Inferno in the wood, a place of confusion, and the idea of the landscape being a place of reflecting the emotion and the confusion of life. So I wonder if you've thought about Dante, the early modern authors, perhaps Italian authors, and how they might correspond with your work on the Japanese garden, on Japanese literature.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. And I think it's also the gardens themselves as emotional landscapes which both reflect emotion and through which emotion emerges, but also the fact that within or Japanese gardens within the broader environment or setting, how especially through the art of borrowed scenery, how the gardens themselves are in dialogue with broader settings and broader social concerns. So there's just many layers of what's happening with the interiority of the characters within the enclosed space of the garden, and then beyond the borders of the garden itself. And I think I really saw that reflected in the contemporary novels, is that the novelists are very keen to foreground where exactly these gardens are situated and to foreground those layers of dialogue.
I've got let me just have a look. There's some others sort of come through. From Lynn here. Do you have a favourite garden in the novels? And have you been to visit any of the gardens in Japan?
So in answer to the first question, my favorite is in The Samurai's Garden, because that was actually the first novel I read in which I encountered Japanese garden many years ago. And that spurred me to investigate the topic more. So for me, there's a sort of nostalgic, affective relationship with that garden. And in terms of having visited Japanese gardens in Japan, I have not, although it's very high on my bucket list, but I make a concerted effort to visit every other Japanese garden that I come across. So for example, the pictures that were in my presentation today were taken from the Klingendel Garden just outside The Hague. That's an early 20th century Japanese garden. And also the rock garden, that picture was taken in Bremen in Germany. So on my travels and where I end up, I do try and engage with how and why and where different Japanese gardens have been created. And they do very much have this global presence. So yeah, that's something I'm really interested in as well.
There's one, I'm going to be greedy here because there is something that occurred to me whilst you were talking about Japanese gardens, and that is the gardens of the early 20th century. And as a horticulturist, I know how seductive plant catalogues are, and how, of course, they were so seductive in the early 20th century. The Yokohama Nursery catalogues, or the acers, irises, wisteria, all of those things which were pictured were brought up very, very quickly, very enthusiastically by people in England and across Europe, as you've just illustrated with one of your slides. And I wonder if you think there was any understanding, any deeper understanding of this, if there is any understanding of the literature, of the literary side of the gardens in the early 20th century, or among early 20th century Europeans. Do you think they saw that depth? Have you found any evidence of that?
I haven't in what I've read so far, or maybe it would be better to say that I found curiosity, and I found a desire to maybe explore these gardens through the written word. Particularly, I'm thinking of Lafcadio Hearn, when he was traveling and writing in Japan in the late 1800s. He wrote, actually, I think I pasted it in the chat, in the list of material, an essay in a Japanese garden. And there he's really engaged in a really fascinating way with the place of the Japanese garden and the tension between the modernization and industrialization of Japan as it transitioned from an isolated nation to a global trading nation in the mid-19th century. So I think it wasn't as explicit maybe as drawing the connections that I was drawing today, but I think there was a curiosity with representing it in the written word, with describing it, with finding names or corresponding names for plant species, or identifying the complexity of categorizing plants. So I think it's something that starts to emerge in Western writing as people start to really engage with bringing elements of these Japanese gardens back to Europe and developing them in European contexts, and American as well, actually.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's just have a look down the chat board here. Lots of thank yous for your clear speaking and clear presentation. Let me just go up, see if I missed anything. There was a comment from somebody a little earlier on about from Max Caligola. There is a tradition in Italy to bring chrysanthemum to the deceased on the Day of the Dead. That's All Souls Day, November the 2nd. A custom that has perhaps something in common with the association of longevity. You mentioned longevity of the poet who was sorry that he picked the chrysanthemum which was fading in his hands, or I can't remember the exact quote, but you obviously remember what I'm speaking about. And also the fact that they blossom late in the autumn. So the symbolism is brought perhaps directly from the symbolism of Japan, or is something which is innate with the flower. Do you think there are crossovers which come with Japanese species? Do you think there are?
Well, I couldn't speak to the Italian context, although I'm fascinated to learn this, so thank you for sharing, Max. However, of course, in Japan, the symbolism attached to the chrysanthemum in terms of longevity was incorporated from China, and much of the development of Japanese gardens and symbolism was initially imported before it was reworked and reimagined and appropriated within its new context. But in terms of the chrysanthemum, that was symbolism that did carry over from China.
You mentioned, just while we're on the same subject, in the same slide or the slide before or after, you mentioned some symbolism with the iris representing something, and I didn't quite catch it. I was busy writing notes, but you did say that the iris represented, and I wondered if you meant that it represented within that single poem, or it generally represented or had some symbolism.
I think at that point I just made the observation that the iris and also the ruined flowers in the second poem were representing the speaker's wistful longing, and that sort of desire that speaker had, that sort of like lament and nostalgia, because it was, "Ah, sweet iris, your face flushed pink, unexpectedly I remember you and sigh." And it's this idea of the iris provoking that nostalgia and that wistful longing and that lament, but yet the iris itself is the meditation and the subject matter of the poem. And similarly with the white flowers, it was "The flood waters from endless showers ruin the white flowers, why not a girl for me?" And it's this, using the flowers to set up in these tiny little vignettes of emotional experience, this sadness that the speaker has, and almost using the plants as the meditative items which spur and reflect their emotional state.
You've frozen there, Anna Rose.
Oh, am I back?
No, you're back.
You are.
Stephen, there's a fascinating question from Jade, which came direct to me, but has now gone to everyone. So we might want to pick up on that. Shall I read it since I've got it? Jade says, "I love what you said about the place of encounter. It is very transportive listening to these passages. Are there any stories with a whimsical perspective that have resonated with you spiritually?"
That is a beautiful question. Really, thank you, Jade. I think I must return once again to the Samurai's garden, because I think, as I mentioned in my talk, that was a garden in which Machu and Sachi really cultivate and develop this relationship, which is characterized by tensions and precarity and the sort of external pressures of the world. But they carve out the relationship apart from that. They carve out the garden space apart from that. And the book itself is intensely meditative, and it takes you into these spaces and into the simplicity and complexity and depth and spirituality of their relationship. So I think for me, that is the one that I return to time and time again for an experience of intimacy in the Japanese garden.
Good. I can see Jade nodding there, so that's obviously hit the right note with that answer. Michael Ann, I think I see Lynn's there's been one person asking about the recording. Lots of thank yous. Michael Ann, I think I'm going to hand back to you. Are you there?
I'm here. I've reappeared.
Okay, that's good.
I've turned back on. And to answer the question about whether the seminar will be recorded, the seminar has been recorded, and it'll be up tomorrow for a week on our Zoom platform, and it'll be available on the IHR site for much longer. We'll send out the links. I just want to make sure that anybody who wants to be on our mailing list will let us know. We're sending things out through the mailing list. So if you're not on the mailing list, could you let us know? Just send a little email or something. So we make sure we get you on the mailing list, and then you'll get the links. Okay, to the Gmail address. It's the whatever the email address is. It's on the flyer anyway. So we want to thank you very, very much, Anna Rose, both for the paper and for such lovely answers to the questions. I mean, with such perception and personal involvement in the subject. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for coming this evening. For me, this is my joy. I'm one passion, so it's a privilege for me to be here. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We could turn on our unmute everybody and applaud. Thank you very, very much. I want to just say that our next seminar is going to be next week. Usually they're every 2 weeks, but because of certain peculiarities this term, we're having one of the seminars next week on the 3rd of June. It's Jane Masters will be speaking about New Lanark World Heritage Site, Legacy of Landscape Industry and Conservation and Development. And that'll be at 6 next Thursday, and we'll send out a flyer for that as well. But thank you again, Mary Rose, and thank you everyone for coming.